What Parliament was trying to do, and of course I was a minister at the time, was to ensure that corporates went from saying we should do our reasonable best to prevent fraud, for it actually to be a requirement that required a higher standard of behaviour. In other words, for them to be taking greater steps to prevent fraud happening in their organisations, because that ultimately is good for society, but also good for Britain as well as a place to invest. There are a lot of private equity firms who might be thinking that ECCTA is not really something that affects us. This is about other kind of corporations. But it's the point that ECCTA is drawn so broadly such that actions by a subsidiary, which could of course mean a portfolio company, could in turn affect the private equity fund higher up the chain. So if you had a situation where an employee of a portfolio company acted in a way that was fraudulent, which could be perceived to benefit the fund, then that in turn could make the fund liable for unlimited fines. And that is something that is not necessarily well understood by all PE funds. The touchstone of all this is common sense. No enforcement agency is going to demand disproportionate steps. So all really that PE funds, or indeed any corporate, needs to do is to take reasonable steps to have procedures in place. Now, what are those procedures? It might be training. But here's the important thing. That training needs to be tailored to the risk. So the first thing that needs to happen is that firms need to sit back and have a long, hard think about which parts of their business are risky, and to tailor the mitigant or the training or the fraud alleviation measure accordingly. What you should be thinking is say, okay, let's look for a second. We have a whole load of divisions in our business. In a car sales business, you might have the human resources department. You might have those guys on the forecourt. You might have people who are security staff. You might have cleaning staff. Now, the risk of fraud for each of those business divisions is not the same. And so what you need to do is tailor your response to different areas. It could be, for example, that for those areas where the risk of fraud is light, that some fairly gentle training on the way into the firm is enough. But for those areas where the risk is greater, you want a training package, and it may be that once a year isn't enough, and you need to be doing it twice a year because the risk is so great. So look, this is about common sense, nothing more than that. But I just make this other point. If you are an American company and you think, hang on, what's going on? This is a British act, we don't need to worry about it. That would be the wrong conclusion to draw. Supposing one of your employees goes out with his girlfriend and he buys dinner on a fraudulent credit card. No one is suggesting for a second that the company should be liable for unlimited fines on the basis of that fraud. What the ECCTA is talking about is those frauds which are intended to benefit the company. So, for example, the person in that car sales firm who fraudulently misrepresents the state of the vehicles that he's selling, and he knows that ultimately that's going to improve the cash flow or the bottom line of the business. That is the kind of fraud which could lead to unlimited fines. And the important point is this, is supposing that car company is a subsidiary of a much larger whole, then the company above it could also be liable. So if a fraudulent or misrepresentation was made from a company in Atlanta, Georgia, and there was a British customer who was deceived, then that would be enough for the US company potentially to be liable. What also if a subsidiary company where the employee who behaved badly was in Britain? That would be enough of the nexus as well. If the impact of the fraud is in Britain, then that can be enough to drag companies from around the world into the net. So what we would do, or indeed any person looking at this seriously, would do a gap analysis initially to say, actually, we've got a whole load of mitigants in place anyway. Do those do the trick? Because if they do, then that's fine. But you would need to show to a prosecutor in due course, we thought about it. We thought about it. We, metaphorically speaking, wrapped a wet towel around our head and we really considered carefully what the elements of risk were. And if you've already dealt with it, that's fine. But the point is this, it may be with some relatively modest tweaks, you can show that your existing measures have been updated to cater for the modern threat and indeed the modern legislative environment.